Hello.
Hello.
Hello. We're happy to see you too.
This bodes well. I want to tell you that the process of preparation for this talk, looking back over a long career in music, was not so easy. The sorting and the sifting and the selecting and the shortening, I cut out huge tracts of writing, which I would have loved to share, but in this time slot, it would have been too cumbersome. If I mapped out my life from the earliest days, early childhood even, I would see for sure that music accompanied me, and supported me, and comforted me, and identified me, and clarified life for me, and gave me so much of the joy that I have experienced in my life. My mother knew this intuitively, and she taught me how to read music at about 3 or 4 because I was picking out tunes on the piano. She managed to get me a decent piano, even though things were not easy for my parents. And she found me good teachers, most significantly Leopold Mittman, from the time I was 11. A great pianist and a great teacher, and in fact the whole family moved to Forest Hills to be near him. And from the moment I was in his home, with the beautiful fine paintings on the wall and carpets upon carpets and beautiful pianos, I knew that that was a world that I wanted to be a part of. And he not only taught me how to play the piano, I could still taste his tone, but he taught me about life. He took me to museums. He cultured me. He was probably the single most significant influence in my whole life. And those pre-teen and teen years were, of course, critical in opening up a world to me. I was with him for about 23 years, with only a short spell of time with another teacher. And the other great influence in my life was certainly nature and the music of nature, which is so related. Music is derivative from all kinds of sources, but so much of the great music has been synthesized and recycled from sounds of nature like bird songs and wind and rain and ocean waves. And I've given many a program about the relationship between nature and music, and I've been very moved in my own life. I love to garden, and it's very related to my feeling of home as a base and a place that I want to be more than any other place. I mentioned how music identified me. This is a little silly, but it's funny that if I'm in town or in the supermarket and I bump into somebody whom I almost even barely know, they see something on my face that says piano, and they lapse into a little pantomime. Are you still tickling the ivories? That's an expression that I really don't like. And the word still is not applicable because I will hopefully be playing till the last days that I have. But I was always cautiously aware of how I never wanted to be liked or loved because of the piano. I remember feeling that way as a child, and I won't say very much about this now, but it's a cautionary tale to parents that if they have an exceptional child, they should be very cautious to separate the doting and the making of a circus monkey to perform very separate from real love, because it can be easily confused for love. And so I won a few competitions when I was still a young person, and there were many paths that I could have chosen. I knew clearly that I didn't want to live out of Elise's and end up in Gopher Prairie, Idaho somewhere, and then somewhere else the next week. I wanted children, I wanted a family at home. I wanted everything. And in many ways, I think I was very lucky and got it, because I have played wherever, whenever I wanted to. And I have played on the West Coast, but I have centered, and in Chicago, but most of the work that I've done has been in the Northeast, especially since my children were growing up here and I didn't want to be away. I actually, on the subject of identity, wanted to get away from my identity, and I wanted to, so we took a vacation, Ernie and I, to Venice with this. I had one of my sole objectives was to be an ordinary person, to put my musical work behind me, and to just be a tourist and relax. So we were, the first morning that we were in Venice, we took a walk. And every fourth doorway is a church in Venice. So we walked into this beautiful old church. And there was a harpsichord set up for a concert on the altar. With a beautiful lid, painted, beautiful. And I felt like some string was attached to me and drawing me in. And there was a priest nearby, and I went over to him and I said, in faltering Italian, Signore, posso suonare il clavicino, per favore? Father, may I play the harpsichord, please? No, he said, no, signora, with a very gruff voice. And then I said, ma io sono pianista, but I'm a pianist. And something totally changed in his face, and he said, vendi, vendi. And there I was, sitting down, playing Bach and Scarlatti, and some parishioners, and some tourists, and some choristers who had been rehearsing in the back came around, and so much for, you know, I've learned to embrace the fact that I am what I am, which is a pianist, and hopefully many other things as well. And actually, there must be some kind of cachet about being a pianist, because he showed my husband and me the crypts and the cloisters that were not open to the public, so it's also a passport. But it can't, sometimes, you know, I talked about the consolation factor. After 9/11, I couldn't go near the piano. I know a lot of musicians who felt that way. It was as though the piano were covered with ashes. And it was several weeks that had gone by, and I didn't know how I would get myself to practice again. It was, I was so depressed. And then I was driving in the car, and something came on the radio. I knew immediately it was in G major. I knew immediately it was Beethoven. And I soon knew that it was a rondo, because the theme kept coming around again, and there's something very, very reassuring about that genre, about the return of the theme. I always found rondos very pleasant because of that. So I looked for it in my music library, and there it was, Opus 51, number 2. I'm only going to play you a short snippet of that particular piece. I will play whole things eventually. But I just want you to experience, if I'm successfully communicating it, the hope and the love and the purity in this little rondo. so sweet, like a soft blanket. That's what got me back after that. But sometimes it's not so possible to use music as a consolation. A few years ago, I was invited to do 3 different gigs in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where my son teaches at LSU, teaches cello and chamber music. One for the LSU Music Department, one for Louisiana State Music Teachers Association, and one for the Baton Rouge Piano Club. And everything was all set. My books had been ordered, and I had my plane ticket. And then Katrina struck. And it was immediately clear that I couldn't go, because first of all, only essential flights were being allowed to land there, and maybe a half a mile from where I was to perform, dead bodies were floating in Lake Montparker. And for so many reasons, there was no power, people were homeless and traumatized. So I called to cancel, and the woman who was the concert organizer got on the phone with me, and she started to yell at me, "Y'all can't cancel. We need music to forget and to deliver us from this tragedy. Y'all don't understand the value of music. We have your books here, and we're expecting you to come." There was no way that I seemed to be able to tell her that I could not, how impossible it was. And yes, that I did understand the value of music. Actually, Beethoven has been my musical rock and God, and I'd like to play you the first movement of the Opus 26 Sonata. And the word amabile comes to me because it's so amiable and beautiful. It's a theme and variations. a piece that seems to exactly reflect your feelings and your thoughts and even the stages of your life. Many years ago, I was invited to play the Schumann Piano Concerto with an orchestra on Long Island. And each movement represented 3 stages of my life. The first movement was full of passion and chaos. And the second movement is so full of questions and soul-searching. And the third movement was pure elation and joy, which I finally found with Ernest 32 years ago. Schumann, for me, is the most noble of the Romantics. I think he has, of course, the most quixotic personality, multiple personalities, and he knew that, and he named his personalities, and a lot of his music, in his music he notates, this is Eusebius, and this is Florestan, and this is my outgoing self. And he was himself a music journalist and a writer, and he was a pianist and composer, but he wrecked his hand with unspeakable remedies and quackery so that he could never play the piano again, which was a blessing in disguise for Clara, for whom he wrote such beautiful music to play, and for us pianists who came afterwards. I will play a short group of pieces that I plucked from the Carnival, which is a suite of pieces of vignette-like portraits of his friends, of his own multiple personalities, and including Chopin and the piece that he wrote called Chopin, is as Chopin-esque as anything Chopin ever wrote. So the 5 pieces that I'll play are called Valse No, Lettre dansant, 4 notes that were the motif of that weaves through the entire Carnival. Chiarina, his love name for Clara, Chopin, and Estrella, one of his girlfriends before he married Clara. And when Clara ever performed for the Carnival, she left that married. Beethoven and Brahms wore their hearts on their sleeves. So here's the opening of an andante called Andante Favori by Beethoven. If you can't hear the words "I love you" buried in this opening few bars, then it's my fault. Brahms intermezzo with that same cadence and yearning. Just a little experiment. I wanted both medium. I could never not write and I could never not play the piano. I didn't want to make the choice. I always have had the impulse to record and to share and to clarify by writing. Somebody once said, I write to see what I think. And the books evolved very naturally. Basically, my writing has fallen into two categories: the music journalism that I did mostly for Clavier magazine as a senior editor for over 15 years, and also freelance pieces for the New York Times and other music publications. And the books. The first book, The Anatomy of a New York Day, started as a diary for my own catharsis. I had this yellow pad on the piano, and it subverted the work I did at the piano. If I thought of an interesting notion, I would stop playing and scribble it down, and it grew and grew, lots of pages, and full of not only insights, but the overwhelming joy to be preparing this program at the highest level that I could do, and also self-doubts and fears. And I can't tell you the whole long story about how it fell into the hands of a publisher, and before I knew it was a book, even before I knew whether I wanted to share all those personal thoughts and feelings. But there it was a book, and I got hundreds of letters from garden variety pianists who shared these feelings, and some came out of the closet and gave their own daily recitals as a result of reading this book, and I went to some of them. And also renowned pianists like Glenn Gould, who wrote me, this is the most compelling piece of music journalism I've come across in many years. And many, many other renowned pianists wrote me that they read it and that the same feelings existed for them and for all of us. So that was the first book, and then A Pianist Landscape came after that. And maybe that's my favorite of my books. It's full of essays on everything related to being a pianist. Being at home and the beautiful work we do by ourselves. Then on stage, the love-hate performance, the love and hate that we feel about performance. Pianos I've known, I have to say that since 1998, when I was invited to join the roster of style artists, I've been extremely lucky to play beautiful, black, long, glossy, gorgeous instruments. But sometimes, I mean, a friend of mine wants me to tell you all a story about how one started rolling across the stage and I was holding on to the black notes and scooching myself along until I had to stop and get a wedge put in. And this piano was rocking like a rowboat when I was rehearsing, up and down every time I applied the pedal, so I had to jam books under the pedal mechanism. And now I see that it's leaving, so I hope the whole thing doesn't burn in the middle of the concert. But is there a cell phone that's ringing? Could somebody turn that off, please? And then there's the Blue Piano and Other Stories. That's 31 short stories from a musician's life, mine. Probably more than anybody wants to really know about me. And then there's Polly and the Piano. It's a mostly true part fantasy book about a pianist and her dog who land up together on the stage of Carnegie Hall. And I thought it was a children's book, but many adults have told me it's not. It's as much an adult book, and it has a CD in the cover. A pianist journal in Venice that has a watercolor on every page that was done over several trips that Ernie and I took to Venice. And it has a mysterious tale that happens in an old Venetian palazzo, the story of that. And The Pianist's Homecoming is a sequel to my first book, The Anatomy of the New York Day. I gave a concert in the same hall, now called Weill Recital Hall, not Carnegie Recital Hall, on a very special birthday that I had. And the very evening of my birthday. The music journalism was done as I said, for Clavier, mostly for Clavier magazine. And I had a column that I could write carte blanche on anything that I wanted to, vaguely related to music and the piano, called Caroline. And I got the opportunity to meet hundreds of world-renowned pianists whom I interviewed, many in their own studios and hotel rooms and restaurants, for cover stories for Clavier. The best part about that work was that, as a pianist myself, the artists shared their work on a different level than had I been a journalist from People magazine, for example. And we played on the table of restaurant tables, you know, show fingering and talked about deep stuff and music. And I mean, I'm remembering driving up to Claudio Arao's house on his 80th birthday for a special issue celebrating that. And there he was digging in the garden with bare hands, just as I like to do, much to my husband's chagrin. And in his studio, he had a collection of black ebony African sculptures that were so powerful, and he called them my friends, and they were looking at him as he played. And I was in Victor Borge's house. I'll tell you a little about that later. On Sound in Greenwich, Connecticut, with great paintings on the wall, and George Shearing on the Upper East Side. And after the interview, we played Mozart on 2 pianos together. He was a fine pianist. And often these talks led to valuable coachings for me. Horacio Gutierrez in the Steinway basement, he helped me prepare the Schumann piano concerto, and Peter Frankel at Yale. I played the Schumann Fantasy for him in an early stage, and Jerry Lowenthal, who was the chairman of Juilliard, insisted that I come and play my program in his apartment in New York, and Andre Watts with Liszt, and Radu Lupu called me from London. I'm not trying to name drop, it sounds, it's echoing in my ear a little bit like that. I'm just saying what a privilege it was for me to meet these wonderful people, and everything I learned from them, their wit and their wisdom, I recycled and shared with my students. Everything in my life seems to have a recycling into something else that I do. And I learned from them not only their methods of study, but that their own private lives interacted with their professional lives in many of the same ways mine did. I mean, for example, I was all set to give a New York recital, and then my marriage ended about 30 some odd years ago, and I had to cancel that. And that kind of thing does happen. People get ill. I know Andre Watts played with pneumonia on the stage of Carnegie Hall one evening, and other, you know, you see canceled on the fronts of huge halls because artists are, you know, human beings, and life does get in the way sometimes. But there was a big downside to this life of mine of interviewing artists. And that was that it sucked time and energy away from the work that I was doing at the piano. And I realized at one point that I was giving away the sense of my own ego to them, serving their egos, which was fun while it lasted, but then I stopped. And I'll tell you one not so pleasant episode. I was in Victor Borge's house. We all know what a jolly fellow he is known to be. In fact, he answered the door in a tux top and blue jeans on the bottom. That was already very funny, and I thought I was going to have a very good time. So I was asking him a couple of questions, and then maybe it was the third question that I posed, because he was a really fine pianist, and he couldn't take the stress of performance, so he went into comedy. But I asked him, do you ever play for yourself? And if so, what kind of music would that tend to be? And just as I was posing it, the phone rang, and his secretary, a young man, walked in with the telephone, and he started to get furious, Borge did, and he yelled at the young man. He said, "Do you see an interview going on in here? How dare you interrupt? And you," and he turned to me. He said, "Learn how to do an interview, young lady, and ask one question at a time, and then back off." And then I heard myself say, and I must say, I grew up more than I knew until that very moment. I said, Mr. Borger, you had a show very late on Broadway last night, and you must be very tired. Perhaps you would prefer not to do this interview, and I can go home and practice. It's fine with me. He said, oh, are you a pianist? So I said, yes, I am. He said, play something. And I never say no, and I never have said no. So I sat down, I think I played part of the Bach partita for him, and he said, well, why didn't you tell me? You're an artist, you know, and he got nice, but it was too late. I finished the interview, and I drove out of his gate, and I did something I now regret. I rewound it, and I erased that part of the interview, because I never wanted to hear him yelling at me ever again. And so there's a big space. I mentioned that everything that I learned was recycled to my teaching, and I should tell you that my teaching has become the most creative and joyful part of my work. I have some of my beloved students here. There's this whole sense of community and the passing down of information from one teacher to the next through generations. I have several of my pupils are music teachers, lawyers, all kinds of occupations, but all of them love it so very much. And I think teaching is the most noblest, is the most noble of missions. And I feel like I want to teach everything I have learned to all of them. My own teacher, Leopold Mittman, of whom I was a scholarship student, studied with Alexandra Michalewski in Warsaw, who was a student of Carl McEuley. He was the star student of Carl McEuley, who was the star student of Chopin. And I love that sense of lineage and heritage, so I'll play you two impromptus. Be quiet and I'll play something for you. Two Chopin impromptus. Chopin, of all piano composers, makes you feel like a pianist, like you're flying. It's a wonderful feeling to play Chopin. And he understood the hand on the keys perhaps better than any other composer. I spoke about how much I love my teaching and how it's a source of love in all directions, and that is nowhere clearer than when we have our group sessions. Every few months we all gather, and it's as much a class listening as playing for each other, and what we heard and suggestions, benign, generous, and it's where I hope my students develop a sense of performance, not as trial by fire, but as a gift that you give somebody who's listening. And my students have become like a second family for me, and lots of laughter and serious, along with the serious talk. One of the composers I consider essential for myself and for my students is Bach. And it wasn't for no reason that Chopin and Schumann required their students to play Bach and make it their daily bread. And it's not only because it's preparatory for all other music, but because it elevates us. Andras Schiff, who's one of the great pianists that I had a privilege of interviewing and getting to know, said, if you do not like Bach, it's best not to admit it. I'll play a few movements from the French Suite, number 5 in G major. I wish I had time to play all of them with repeats, but as I said, I had to really shorten the program. They're all dances, and even though you may not know how to dance a sarabande or a courante or a lively jig at the end, if I'm successful, I hope you feel like you want to dance. conversations between the piano and oneself, as Debussy once said. And most performing artists will never be entirely pleased with any performance or any recording that they have made. And certainly I've experienced that and maddened people who have told me, hey, I really enjoyed the performance, and I have put it down as less than what I had wanted to do. In fact, I came upon, in the many green rooms, illustrious names of people who were really gave 100 encores and were crying because they didn't care for what they had done that evening. Yet I have to say that I feel that I have just recently achieved my own most important work in the last series of recordings that I've been working on, called The Composer's Landscape, taken from a series I did at Steinway and focusing on one composer at a time in depth and discussing the particular exigencies and challenges of playing that particular composer and using the landscape as a metaphor for the score. And I'm planning 7 or 8, and the first 5 are there already. Bach, Mozart, Chopin, Beethoven, and Schumann. I culled a lot of my best live performances, a process one of my dear friends called harvesting, and I thought it was a beautiful word. The next one that I'm going to do is Brahms, and then the next one after that, Schubert. Brahms is a composer that usually enters your life and your musical consciousness as a young teenage musician, and just stays and goes through several metamorphoses. I am enjoying the discovery of Brahms in some of my teenage students now. It's very moving to me. Just as their love for his music is unfurling before my eyes, and I'm the lucky one who gets to witness it and help reveal it to them. When I was in my first year at Queens College, I was trying out for a concerto competition, and I wanted to use the Brahms First Piano Concerto, and I think I was 17 or 18, and my teacher, Leopold Mittman, tried to talk me out of it because, first of all, it's written for very large hands, and it's a monumental concerto, and to hear a young person play it, he thought was not a great idea, but I was determined, a trait that seems to have characterized me throughout my life. And I ended up winning and getting to play it twice with an orchestra, and that was one of the high points of my early musical life. And from that moment on, Brahms has been one of my great loves, including the late short piano works, which he called the lullabies of my old age. Excuse me. I don't like to think I'm ready for lullabies of old age. But these works still soothe me, and I have quite a different understanding and pleasure from it. So I'll play you an intermezzo, my favorite intermezzo from Opus 117. Maybe I have talked and written too much about music, sort of like dancing about architecture or something like that. And isn't there supposed to be an air of mystery about what we do as performing arts, the illusion that we're doing something incredibly difficult with apparent ease? And, well, it's not so easy, and it's incredibly complex a process that one wants and needs to analyze it, and that's what I've been trying to do for a lot of my life. And it's been hard work, solitary hours, like a monk in confinement. Lots of joy, many self-doubts, and lots of courage. I'd like to just end by reading you the last paragraph from my book, A Caddis Homecoming. And then after that, I hope that if you have any questions, you'll ask me, and then you'll browse some of my books and CDs, and we can talk a little bit. There are many varieties of courage. Giving a solo recital is in some ways like a journey of endurance. And getting up on a stage to perform, to transform a million black dots on a page into some of the world's great masterworks, counting on your brain, your body, your wits, your ears, your eyes, your nervous system, and drawing from everything you have learned about music and life and the beloved literature you've chosen, with the entire hall vibrating with antenna focused with intense expectation on only one person. That is an act of courage, a gesture of generosity and high-level communication that I have lived and loved.
Anyway.